Welcome to the next installment of the PIPE workshop, the Political Institutions and Political Economy workshop at the Bedrosian Center at the University of Southern California. My guest today is Jared Rubin. Jared is a professor in the George Argyros School of Business and Economics at Chapman University. He's an economic historian interested in the political and religious economies of the Middle East and Western Europe. His research focuses on historical relationships between political and religious institutions and their role in economic development. His book, Rulers, Religion, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not, published in 2017 on Cambridge University Press, explores the role that Islam and Christianity played in the long-run reversal of fortunes between the economies of the Middle East and Western Europe. It was awarded the Douglas North Best Book Award for the best research in institutional and organizational economics published during the previous 2 years, awarded by the Society of Institutional and Organizational Economics. Jared's work has appeared in journals such as Review of Economic Studies, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal, Management Science, and many others. He's the co-director of Chapman University's Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society, and the president of the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society. He serves on a number of editorial boards, and he's been awarded over $1 million in grants from the John Templeton Foundation for his work in the economics of religion. He graduated with a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 2007 and a BA from the University of Virginia in 2002. Welcome to Jared Rubin. And Jared will be presenting some co-author work today with his former dissertation advisor, Avner Greif.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a really great thing you have going here. And I'm just delighted to be part of it, and especially given who else you have had and will have. It's a really great slate. So about this paper. This is a paper Avner and I started in 2010, and it's still very much a work in progress. And there's a variety of reasons, some personal, but the non-personal ones are just that every time we think we have a paper, there's more and more and more we want to add. And part of the reason that this is the case is we're going to be addressing one of the big stories in economic history, particularly kind of the economic history, you might say, of the rise of the West, of really a political economy in the West, and particularly England. And we are going to be not necessarily, I don't think attacking is very much a wrong word, but maybe adding to it is the right way to think about it. So I might as well just get started with what I'm talking about here. And I do think that this question that we begin with is one of the big ones, especially since North and Weingast's 1989 article looking at credible commitment in the case of in England following the Glorious Revolution. So how did England transition to a limited constitutional monarchy? So Avner and I are economic historians, also very, very much interested in historical political economy. And this is one of these questions that is essential to both, I think. Certainly historical political economy, thinking about where limited governance eventually comes from, is an incredibly important question, but also for many reasons that the literature has taken, especially since North and Weingast's article, taking kind of the economic implications of limited governance, particularly in England. So again, as I mentioned, North and Weingast, Acemoglu, Robinson, more or less take the North and Weingast argument. They look at it slightly differently, but for the most part, they're both very much in the same camp. They both place immense importance on violent, or in one case a violent event, but in two cases in which a king was removed by Parliament. The civil wars of the 1640s, which culminated with the execution of Charles I, and the Glorious Revolution, which culminated with James II fleeing. In their telling, constitutional monarchy comes about because of conflict and the resolution of conflict in favor of a way that allowed the commitment of the monarch to be credible. Now, what this means is can mean multiple things. In their telling, though, what's really important is that, or at least especially in North and Weingast telling, is that the Constitution that emerges in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution is one in which all sides had a credible commitment to follow. It secured certain rights for, especially the elite. That, in their telling, there was a credible commitment to follow, in large part because Parliament had shown twice in the previous 50 years that it could remove a king that transgressed its rights. Smuggle and Robinson tell a pretty similar story. They're talking about more inclusive versus exclusive institutions, but their story of England is more or less the same. All right, now the point of our paper is not to cast doubt on the importance of credible commitment. We do think that's incredibly important, that an executive, whether it be a king, a president, whatever, is able to not just make statements, but credibly commit to following through with them. We also don't disagree that constitutions are an important mechanism for that to happen. One thing we are going to push back on, though, is the specific events that happened in the 17th century as being the interpretation of these events as being the ones that are the ones driving this. The big issue, or not the big issue, but one issue with these events as determining the credibility of the Crown's commitment is that in order for this theory to work, Parliament, in a sense, has to have coercive power. They have to have the capacity to remove the Crown. Yet, it's not clear that this was the case by any means. In fact, Parliament had no military power after 1646, after the First Civil War. So once the new model army was created I understand that there's probably a variety from next to nothing to quite a bit in the audience of how much you know about this period in English history. But after the end of the First Civil War, the army becomes its own entity. And in fact, it's the army that's in favor of executing Charles. It's the army that then more or less forces most of Parliament out of Parliament to be able to control Parliament. And then I have some stuff here. Then the military dictatorship under Cromwell in the 1650s. Even after the Restoration, Charles II is given control over the militia, granted a right to a standing army. This was something the Crown had never had before, or had not had in over 400 years. Parliament had nothing in terms of its immediate access to coercive power. In the Glorious Revolution, this was not a parliamentary army that ran James II out of town. It was a foreign army, invited by a few of the members of Parliament, but it was William of Orange and his Dutch mercenary army. So the claim that the threat of removal of the Crown is what's undergirding this is a bit hard to swallow given this context. So the question is, why would Parliament cede control to the coercive power of the state to the Crown? Why did they do this? Why did they grant Charles II control over the militia? Why did they grant him a standing army? This is by no means obvious in the framework in which the threat of removal is key, and the physical threat, the coercive threat of removal is key. How are their rights to threaten, or how are their threats to remove a monarch who transgress their rights credible? How could they make this glorious revolution? They had to invite somebody. That's not a permanent solution by any means. So our conjecture then is that not that these events were unimportant, because they clearly, in fact, we're going to have a slightly different interpretation of them. But our interpretation is that you have to look beyond economic interests and beyond resources. And this is, again, not to say that economic interests or resources are unimportant. They very clearly were. But we also must consider political legitimacy. And this is something that both Avner and I have studied quite a bit and thought a lot about, both how it's formed, what its consequences are for economic outcomes. And this is something we're trying to, in this paper, one of the things that we're trying to really do with this paper is create a more general theory of political legitimacy using the very important example of the rise of Britain's constitutional or England's constitutional monarchy as an example, not just both to explain this important period in history, but also to help motivate and think about our analysis. So what we do, and what we do in the first part of this paper, and this is going to be the bulk of my talk, I think, because I really want to, this is where I think one of our major advancements is, and as I was noting before the talk, this is now up to a 70-page paper that's single-spaced, and it's going to be really hard to go over everything in an hour and a half or however long we have here. So I want to kind of hit on what I believe are the major points of the paper. And I believe one of them is this kind of framework for thinking about political legitimacy that we put forth. So what it is, the way it's created, and what it means for the distribution of economic and political power. All right, so what we do is we build a framework for thinking about what I just noted, how legitimacy is created, what that means, and then what are its consequences. All right, and I'll take you through kind of verbally. We have a model. It's a pretty simple model, but it's mainly a way to think about the various relationships. All right, then we're model and apply it to England's transition. All right, so what is political legitimacy? We have to define this first. There's a long tradition in the social sciences of thinking political legitimacy, less so in economics until fairly recently, but certainly in political science. Weber had very famous three-way definition, looks at various attributes of either the society or the individual, the charisma of the individual. But one issue with most of these definitions and most of these frameworks for thinking about legitimacy is legitimacy tends to be viewed as exogenous. Namely, it's either some characteristic of the individual who happens to be a ruler at the time, or it's some characteristic of maybe the society, the culture that the society has. But what we're trying to do in this paper is we're trying to build a framework for thinking about how it changes over time. Because that really is endogenously. That really is something that's really important, we think, to understanding, not just England's transition, which very clearly there was a transition in the way that rule was legitimated in this period, but to think about why it might change endogenously, we think is really important for understanding a whole host of political economy outcomes. All right. So to kind of take a big step back, to the ground floor. So political legitimacy we view as kind of an internalized belief. So it's the way people view the world, and particularly when we're talking about political legitimacy, how they view political authorities as the ones that are the right to rule and have their demands obeyed. Now, to be very clear before we take a further step, this is an intrinsic belief. This isn't the only thing you need to rule. So access to coercive power is also very clearly necessary. That's more for extrinsic enforcement of one's rule. Just because people have these beliefs and the right to govern the demand and have their demands obeyed does not mean that, for one, everyone will have these beliefs. And two, what happens when one transgresses these beliefs? And three, even in some cases, you can have a ruler that's highly illegitimate but still rules, as long as they have the coercive apparatus of the state at their disposal. That said, it still helps to have political legitimacy. The more legitimate one is, the more effective is the rule. And you can think of effectiveness here in many different ways. Governance costs, for one. If people are more compliant just because they believe that this is the right thing to do, or not just the right thing to do, but the laws are just, then that very clearly affects governance costs. And I think the second point we should be really, the second bullet point here, I think is a really important one, is that we can kind of think of legitimacy and coercion, or coercive power in this case, as substitutes. Because where coercive power, where the capacity to just project power, excuse me, is the least effective, that's where legitimacy can be the most effective. Right, because it motivates compliance even in the absence of any any coercive power of the state, or not, or maybe limited coercive power of the state. And then to be clear, this is just because they're substitutes, you almost will never have a corner solution here for a ruler. You want both, and they generally almost always coexist. It's really hard to think about any set of rulers in history that didn't have at least a little bit of both, that at least lasted for any period of time. All right, so now digging into legitimacy a little more. We define two types of legitimacy. One is what we call personal legitimacy, and this is just how the ruler, how the political authority is viewed by their subjects. And this can be the specific traits of a person. In some cases, it can be how they became ruler. And in a sense, this is very similar to what we were just talking about, in that it's this idea that subjects believe they have a moral obligation to obey. The more, and we should think of this as not as a 0-1, but as a continuum, right? People, some rulers have more personal legitimacy than others, but that doesn't mean that one has a lot and the other has none. And this is going to differ by the type of society, and I'll get to this in a second, how one attains the legitimacy and personal legitimacy in particular in one's society. But this is going to differ by society. So in a democracy, you could think about, the US president derives personal legitimacy by winning a fair and free election, which of course is one of the reasons why the Russia probe recently could have been so damaging to the Trump presidency, because that's the type of thing that really undermines the legitimacy of an elected ruler. Traditionally, the English monarchy, to become the most legitimate person that was in line to become king next was the oldest son of the previous king. I guess that's changed fairly recently. It no longer has to be a son, but that still tends to be the case. The other type of legitimacy we discuss is action-based legitimacy. And these are actions that a ruler or an authority can take. And we should think about there being an action space, to use maybe a slightly mathematical term, in which there are some actions that are legitimate for a certain authority to take, and there are other actions that even a legitimate authority cannot legitimately take. So, we use some contemporary examples here to get you thinking about what we mean by this. In the United States, the president has the legitimate right to declare war in times of emergency, but he cannot unilaterally legitimately enact tax legislation. That's the right of Congress. So this is what we mean by action-based legitimacy. So some action, it can be slightly confusing, but I think these examples really help flesh it out. Some actions can be illegitimate for even a highly legitimate ruler to take. That's the idea here. Namely, a very legitimate president, a president that wins the Electoral College 538-0, still has limits on his or her power in terms of what is legitimate for that person to do. That's the idea here. All right, so this is just, again, these are some background definitions. Now, the next thing we want to get at is why legitimacy and the way legitimacy is derived in different societies differs. So we define what we call a legitimacy principle, which is the justification that is given in a specific society for rule. And this is something that we argue can change over time. So what we mean by a legitimacy or legitimating principle is that it's whatever in that society's historical past is determined what a particular actor needs to do to gain legitimate authority. And this is going to be historically driven. Again, though, historical events can also alter what this is, right? So again, this idea that in a monarchy, it's very different than in a democracy, both of which are going to be very different from, authority in tribes, and even within tribes, there's going to be various rules that are historically driven. Again, the idea behind this framework that we're putting forth is it is meant to be general. It's meant to not just help us think about England or the contemporary United States, but even small-scale societies, legitimacy matters. in terms of ruling, political legitimacy. All right, so legitimacy principles, and this is yet another important point, which is why I bolded them and put them in purple. They contain both the cultural and institutional foundations of legitimacy. So the cultural ones are kind of the ones I've been talking about. Namely, what are the conditions that one needs to satisfy to be legitimate in the eyes of the subjects? Again, this is what I've been talking about. That it can be winning a fair and free election. It can be being the oldest son of the previous king, something like that. The institutional ones, on the other hand, are the ones we're going to be interested in studying because this involves other people, and it involves strategy, and involves strategic interactions. So the institutional foundations of legitimacy are those that help foster the shared beliefs that the authority shares, satisfies these conditions. And importantly here, there are people in society that can help you do that. Now, in some societies, again, now this depends on the history of the society, it might be religious authorities that can do this. So in my book, which Jeff mentioned at the beginning, this is a key point I make in both medieval Christianity and medieval Islam, religious authorities were really important in terms of legitimating rule. And this is what we're thinking about here. So you want to get them on your side, which also, but in the context of the way we're thinking about it, as we'll see here, people don't just help legitimate rulers for free. They want something in return. And what they tend to want in return are some say in the laws, the policies that society puts forth. And that's where the kind of the economic and political consequences of legitimacy start to be seen. All right, so this is where we're going to take much of this talk going forward. And what we call these people that can help foster these means, so I'm just going to go back really quickly to the slide. So the institutional means, or institutional foundations of legitimacy, we call them legitimating agents. And I call them this in my book as well. And I've actually called them this in a few other articles as well. But this is this idea that there are people in society that can affect beliefs about who the legitimate authority is. We put a couple conditions on them. One is that they must have the capacity to say no. In a sense, they can't be a puppet because they have to be providing some type of, say, new information. So again, in some societies, this might be religious leaders. In other societies, so medieval Europe, you would have had religious authorities as being important. You would have also had the aristocracy as being, lords as being legitimating agents. Modern day, you might think of MPs or congresspersons, tribal chiefs, things like that might, or elders in general, depends on the society. So again, the identity of these people, of who might be a legitimating agent, is going to differ by society. But that is going to be determined by the society's history. So this is where we stand. This is how we're thinking about this kind of confluence of how a ruler rules and what people in society might do to either bolster or not their rule.
So a question here, Jared. So Desiree asks, is culture then deeper than institutions? Seems like personal legitimacy is more based on culture, but the legitimacy of action is specified by rules, institutions.
Yeah, in a sense, it's a good question. In a sense, I think that it can be either way. One might be, in a sense, more important than the other. Culture kind of helps shape who the people are that might legitimate. It also helps shape who, the personal legitimacy of somebody, kind of independent of institutions. However, once we get that shaping from, I think of a society's culture, in particular, the interactions and how the interactions play out between rulers and legitimating agents are in large part determined by a society's institutions. And this is what this is the way we're thinking about it, so how society is structured, right? Whether you have, a parliament, whether you have a, tribal hierarchy or something like this. These are institutional features, which again are shaped by culture. So in a sense, yeah, I think one way we're thinking about it, Desiree, if this is kind of the way you were asking about it, is, yeah, we do think of culture as helping shape institutions, and particularly helping us understand why the types of political institutions that legitimate rule differ across societies. If that's what you're asking, then yes, I think culture is maybe deeper than institutions on that front. If you are asking whether, which one kind of has a greater effect on legitimating rule, then I don't think there's one correct answer to that, because that's going to depend on the context we're discussing. Because in a lot of cases, it will be that it's this interaction between rulers and their agents that works through institutions that we think of as more important, but that's not always the case either. Yeah, it's a good question. It's an interesting way of thinking about it too. I think, yeah. So, all right. So in all of this, when we're kind of going one step deeper, what is happening here? So both, we're thinking authority by power. All we mean by that when we say that is authority through coercive power. And coercive power is not, again, it's not something that you have to use all the time. You just have to have the threat of using coercive power for it to be effective. Same with, and so one thing that is shared between authority by power and authority by legitimacy is that what works is by managing the shared beliefs of the people in society. In the case of authority by power, the beliefs that the state has this coercive power and that it can and will be used under certain conditions, which is not always obvious and which is actually can be quite hard to generate. And the same is true of legitimacy, namely that it's not just that I believe the person that the authority is legitimate, but I believe that you believe that the authority is legitimate, and I somehow know that at least you have seen that there have been acts propagating the legitimacy of that actor. So one thing we focus on, and we focus on it not as kind of the only thing, but as one way of thinking about how legitimacy can come about is through public events. Because one thing public events do is they coordinate beliefs. They make everyone aware what others have seen, or a lot of people aware what others have seen. And there's certain types of public events that are really important for this. So coronations or inaugurations are a fairly obvious one. This is really what the reason you have a coronation or an inauguration is to have it's not just to have a big party to celebrate the new ruler. It's also to show that everyone that, and again, it's not just that this person's the ruler, but one thing that's common to coronations and inaugurations are all of the other important people, or whatever you want to, the important people are there. The people we call legitimating agents. So, historically, you would, historically in the case of England, for instance, you would have the major bishops there. You would also have the major lords there. These are the really important people, and the idea that all of these people have common knowledge, that all the other ones know it, but also the people now see, the people, the masses know that the other important people in society have confirmed the rule is important. And one thing, this final bullet point that's nice about looking, from an empirical standpoint at public events is, one thing I've been glossing over here is that while we can conceptualize legitimacy, I think we all kind of, especially presumably people that would attend something like this kind of would presume that it's important. How is it important? It's a black box. What is legitimacy? How can we observe it? How can we measure it? It's not really something that's measurable, and I think that's one of the reasons why especially economists have shied away from digging into it too deeply. But one thing we can observe and measure are these events. And in fact, not only can we observe and measure them, we can observe and measure them from a pretty long time ago, because, as we'll see in a second, something like coronations have been documented, at least in England, since at least William the Conqueror, if not prior. All right, so I'm just going to give you some highly suggestive evidence that this types of public events mattered. They're not meant to clinch anything by any means, but it's just meant to be purely suggestive and supportive. All right, so in the case of England, the hereditary monarchy legitimation principle, the adult son of the previous monarch is the most legitimate. This is obviously not unique to England, but most monarchies, this is the case. Whenever a monarch dies, there might be a number of people who want to claim to the throne, but oftentimes it's the oldest son of the previous monarch, and it really helps if they're an adult, because all types of fights can happen over who's actually ruling and whatnot when it's a child. So when we first started this, and I think I gathered these data now a good 9-10 years ago, said, all right, well, let's just look at coronation ceremonies. And we gathered all these different types of data on coronation ceremonies. Who was there? Because there's a few books that have really kind of dug into all aspects of coronation ceremonies, again, going all the way back to William I. And when they happened, how long after the king or queen came to the throne did they happen? And one thing we noticed almost immediately, and this is pretty, I just think I was surprised how, and still am surprised 9 years later, how strong this relationship is we said, all right, well, one way to think about it would be if you have a relatively low personal legitimacy, and by low personal legitimacy, in this case, all I mean is you're a non-adult male heir. So you could be female, you could be a child, or you could be a non-heir, because obviously there were plenty of times where the dynasties changed. All right, so if you're a non-adult male heir, you probably want to have your coronation right away, because coronations are these moments that signify that this is the legitimate heir, or the legitimate ruler rather, and that everyone recognizes that. If you're an adult male heir, yeah, you still want to have a coronation at some point to recognize this, but it's not as pressing. So we just gathered these data. These are the data. Again, we're not running regressions on this. There's minimal amount of data points. There's a variety of reasons that you might give for why you see some of the patterns here. But one of the things that's really striking is, we separated on the left is adult male heirs, on the right's non-adult male heirs. So the people on the right are the ones that want to have it right away. People on the left can wait. If you look at the very bottom where we give the averages, and you can even see it just by looking at the numbers. Most of the numbers on the right are in the double digits. Most of the numbers on the left are in the triple digits. Again, this isn't meant to prove anything, but it's consistent with the way we're thinking about it. Just that, the people that were in the more precarious situations wanted to have their coronations more quickly. We know, after 1689, after the Glorious Revolution, this might have become a less pressing thing, but as you can see at the bottom here, this holds whether you look at overall or pre-1689. All right, so to move on, how we're thinking about this, I'm not going to give any Greek letters or anything. We do have a model. I think we're even going to eventually relegate it to the appendix. But what I do want to go over is our framework, and our framework's really straightforward. But I think it rests on a few assumptions. But these assumptions are kind of ones that I've already discussed because they're built into this framework and basically are definitions. All right, so if we imagine a ruler that has various agents from which they can choose from, maybe to help legitimate their rule, this could be leading bishops. In the case, let's use the case of England. It could be lords. It could eventually be the commons. All right, so the ruler has various people from which they can choose from. And in return for legitimating their rule, whatever that means, they agree to policy concessions, or perhaps a partitioning of the policy space. And all we mean by that latter point is, if you remember when I discussed action-based legitimacy before, we can think of the types of actions that one has legitimate reign over as changing over time as well. So an example, which I'm actually not going to get too deeply into in this presentation, but we do in the paper, so I might as well kind of give you an idea of what this meant, is, so under Henry VIII, for instance, Henry VIII brings in the Reformation, and he pushes through the Reformation via Parliament, via acts of Parliament. This was something Parliament had by no means ever been tasked to do prior to this. They were not asked questions of religion. That was the purview of the Crown and Church. So this was something fundamentally new that Parliament was being asked to adjudicate and to create laws for. And we argue that in a case like this is a changing of the policy space. This is now saying that Parliament has a legitimate right, and the Crown is able to do this because they're able to grant it, because prior to this, the Crown it was the Crown's legitimate right to make laws on religion. they were giving this right as part of this kind of back and forth with Parliament over a new space. So the way we view this then is, well, why would you want, if you're the crown, why would you even want to go to these people in the first place? You might think of it as the probability of staying in power. That could be one reason. We're just looking at it basically as the probability that laws are followed. You can't really rule if people aren't following your rule. How and why do people follow rule? So again, this goes back to what we've been talking about, legitimacy and or coercion. Now, the more legitimate your rule is, the higher the probability that you'll be followed. So we then just say, all right, the more personally legitimate the ruler is, and this might be, again, their own characteristics. It could be if you're an adult male heir or not, but also the legitimating power of those that legitimate you. So your legitimating agents, they can add legitimacy to what you're doing. Now, there is a commitment problem that once legitimacy or maybe resources are given from these agents, the ruler might be able to be renege. But one thing we discussed that we think is kind of fundamentally different from the types of commitment problems that North and Weingast were talking about is that resources and legitimacy are themselves very different. So one thing that North and Weingast noted is that a problem that the crown had was that once they were granted resources by Parliament, they could then do anything they wanted with them. And that was the commitment problem. So because of that, Parliament was pretty hesitant to give, especially the Stuarts, resources to do, because they knew that they weren't going to act consistent with their wishes. Legitimacy is different, though. Legitimacy is something that can be pulled back. It's something that if Parliament legitimates the crown by maybe an act of Parliament, something like this, and then the crown just goes off and does things that are very obviously illegitimate or something else, Parliament can undo that. All right. So this is something that we view as also kind of an important distinction between the two. That's enough to kind of get us to where we want to be, and to kind of think about how this might help explain history, or the history we're interested in for the sake of this paper. So we view rulers as having kind of two characteristics: their legitimacy and their access to income or wealth. They need both of these things. They're negotiating over both of these things with their agents. And either a low legitimacy or a poor ruler is going to need legitimacy and, frankly, resources from their agents, and they should be willing to cede policies to get it. This is kind of basic. We can think about this as a basic bargaining game, where a low legitimacy or poor ruler is just coming to the bargaining table with little bargaining power. On the other hand, a high legitimacy or wealthy ruler is going to be less in need of legitimacy, again, coming to the bargaining table with strong bargaining power. And not only would they prefer to not cede too much to the agent, but they really don't want to have to negotiate with a strong agent who's also coming to the table with strong bargaining power. And thus they might try to change the agents. That is not, as we'll see when we dig in the history, it can be a little harder to do than I'd like to think. So conflict between, and now we're getting to, using the terms of English history here, Parliament and the crown is more likely when the crown's either highly legitimate or rich. And this is even more so the case when the agent is powerful. Okay. All right. So implications for the history we've been discussing here and we will be looking at. First off, the English crown should have had greater reliance on the House of Commons under the low legitimacy Tudors. And I will discuss in a few slides here why we're going to say that the Tudors, beginning with Henry VII, all the way up through Elizabeth I, really had relatively low legitimacy. Yet the Stuarts who followed them, beginning with James I in 1603, had relatively high legitimacy. So when we're talking about what this means in the context of what, in the verbiage of what I was just noting, is that what this means is that the low legitimacy rulers, the Tudors in this case, should have been willing to cede more to their legitimating agents. And for reasons we'll see in a second here, this became the House of Commons. Previously, prior to the Tudors, really, the House of Commons was relatively weak. Historians have discussed a Tudor revolution that happens to the House of Commons. It was mainly the House of Lords that would have been, and the church, that would have been the two primary sources of legitimacy. All right, implication number 2 follows directly from the first, is that because the Tudors came prior to the Stuarts, and what happened over the court. So one thing I've kind of omitted from this discussion, which is not omitted at all from the paper, is that through the course of using an agent, that agent also becomes stronger over time, because now they are seen by all of the relevant people, including the population, in this case the House of Commons, as a source of legitimacy. They are, in a sense, what we described as the legitimating principles changing, so that over time, endogenously, going through the House of Commons, getting acts of Parliament becomes a source of legitimacy. Well, when the Stuarts come to the scene in 1603, this had become an entrenched principle. And what that means is that you have now a more legitimate set of kings interacting with a more legitimate agent. This is precisely what we just noted is going to lead to conflict. Conflict need not be violent. Obviously, if you remember from the first couple of slides there, it ended up being violent, at least in the civil wars. But when we're talking about conflict here, we actually mean 3 types of conflict. One can be just over legitimacy principles themselves. What is the right way to rule? Who has the capacity to legitimate rule? We'll discuss this in a bit, but to preview what we're going to say in this context is that by the end of the Tudor period, it become quite clear, and we're going to show some data that I think really helps stamp this, that acts of Parliament became a much more important way of ruling. And what we're going to say, and this is important because this is kind of setting the stage for law and following the law not being above anyone, as being a principle which could be a method for legitimating English rule. The Stuarts attempted to change this, and for reasons we'll see. Again, if you don't know the history, I'll get to this in a second. But that can be one type of conflict. The other types of conflict is even if they agree over the legitimacy principle, even if the Stuarts use the legitimacy principle of going to Parliament or going to the House of Commons for legitimacy, you can still have conflicts over what the outcome is. And that still happens today, of course. We're going to be seeing a lot of that over the next few months in the United States, I think. And then finally, the third place is the battlefield. If you can't solve it relatively peacefully, that's when the last resort is used. All right, so now let's get to some of the history to kind of, now that we have this framework, to think about how this applies to this extremely important period in English history. Because again, by the end, by 1689, you do get an English constitution. You do get this transition to constitutional monarchy beginning. I mean, yes, it's definitely true that England in the 18th and even 19th century was not this ideal, corrupt-free place. I mean, there's a lot of corruption that happened in English politics, especially the 18th century. But the type of constraint that came about in this period, I think, is something that signified a fundamental break in many ways from not just English history, but really the history of most of the rest of the world in terms of real constraint over political rule. All right, so did the Tudors. We have to justify our metrics here. Did they have low legitimacy? Yeah, they did. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons to believe that this was the case. It begins with Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who he pretty much checks every box that you would want of not having legitimacy. He claimed it through his maternal line by illegitimate descent. He won it on the battlefield, and he was the ultimate victor in the War of the Roses. But even then, he wasn't the primary person. I mean, he essentially became the leader because so many other potential claimants to the throne on his side died. He was also Welsh, not English. Throughout his reign, and even into the reign of his son Henry VIII, there were repeated pretenders to the throne. And really, when this is important because it means there were challenges to his legitimacy. That's what a pretender is. It's somebody who else is, claiming to be the truthful king. That in what we're concerned with here, that's a challenge to the legitimacy of the crown. All right, subsequent tutors were not that much more personally legitimate. So Henry VIII, again, as I mentioned, he was an adult male heir. He comes to the crown about 24 years after the end of the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII's rise. There are still pretenders at this time, Yorkist pretenders. He also shoots himself in the foot if we're thinking from a narrow legitimating perspective, in that he removes one of the two key pillars of legitimacy, the church, by installing the Reformation. And as we said, before, and this is quite important for thinking through this. Yes, obviously the Anglican Church, there was a church that replaced the Catholic Church, but this church was primarily under the thumb of the ruler, so not nearly as effective at legitimating rule. His son, who comes to the throne, Edward VI, sickly child, dies around age 15, I believe, 14 or 15. And then his two daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, when they come to the throne, at least, Elizabeth ruled enough, certainly by the end of her rule, she would have been considered a legitimate monarch. But even though there was plenty of challenges to her, of course, these are the first two female monarchs in English history, with the exception of one highly contested rule in the mid-12th century. There was no precedent since William the Conqueror of having a female queen be the sole ruler. So this was a line that initially it wasn't an accident, and that Henry VII rather took it by violence, but in a sense also by bad luck. The famous story of the Reformation, why Henry VIII brought it, was that he had no male heir. He eventually does get one, but this is both a mixture of luck and history playing this role, that they were not really legitimate. And what we see here is, and so we create these legitimacy indices. These first three columns are just ones that are something about the ruler themselves that might have played a role in their legitimacy. So were they an adult male heirs? You see, Henry VIII was the only one of the Tudors. A couple of the Stuarts were. And even James II is kind of a no yes at the bottom there, because he was the brother of the king that did not have a child to follow him. And even James I, while certainly not an heir, was willed the throne by Elizabeth. Was there a disputed succession? I mean, with the case of the Tudors, it's pretty much all, and actually the case with the Stuarts as well. So the Stuarts aren't clearly much better in that. In the case of religion, though, this is something that Henry VIII really brings a lot of strife, and really makes it difficult on his children, because so Edward the Sixth is a Protestant. That's fine. Mary the First tries to turn back the clock. Elizabeth I tries to turn it back again. By the time you get to the Stuarts, though, until James II, you have three at least professed Protestants. Even though, as we'll see, religion did play a pretty major role in their conflicts. All right. So what our framework, just how to think about our framework then, is because they have a weak cultural base of legitimacy, they should have sought to strengthen their legitimacy. They should have sought the institutional means of legitimacy. So back to Desiree's question then, that's why I kind of didn't know exactly how to answer, because it can kind of be one or the other. If you have a very strong cultural base, sometimes the institutional base matters less. In the case of the Tudors, they had a very weak cultural base. They weren't, for a whole host of reasons. There were plenty of people in English society, and plenty of powerful people, that did not think they were the rightful rulers. So they should have really sought to bolster their institutional basis of legitimacy. And that's what our framework at least suggests should have happened. Yeah. And so they did. Yeah, of course they did. And what's really important, I think, is, so one thing that we only and one reason this paper has grown to be as long as it was, is we didn't even start this paper with Henry VII. We didn't even think about how important he was to the situation. But then as we started really digging this history, we realized even though he's kind of an underplayed player in this history, he actually ends up being really important. Because when he comes to the throne, not only does he have low legitimacy, but he changes one of the pegs of legitimacy that the English crown had traditionally stood on. Again, traditionally these had been the lords and the church. Well, he had just finished completing a very bloody civil war with the lords. Many of the Yorkists remained in power. So this was not a group of people he could really rely on. He still certainly relied on the church. In fact, one of the first things he does is he sends for a papal bull that legitimates him as the rightful king, and he uses the newly invented printing press to spread it throughout England. It's one of the biggest uses of the printing press in its first 50 years in England, in fact. So they couldn't rely on the House of Lords as previous kings had. And it's not just that they relied on the Lords, because the previous kings had not really relied on the Lords so much for adjudication, even though they had done that as well, especially among the elite, but they also relied on them for administration. And this is another part of the paper, because I only have an hour and a half, I'm not going to be able to get into too much detail. But the Lords tended to be, and this is, I mean, often when we think of feudal Europe and generally, we think of Lords as administering most types of local law and order and really stuff coming from the top. So what Henry VII starts in motion, and that kind of continues throughout the Tudor period, is replacing the services of the great lords with those of the justices of the peace, who tend to be lower gentry, those similar people that end up in the House of Commons. He also, again, so Henry VII also appoints high clergy to an influential position. So what he's doing is he's attempting to slightly change the legitimacy principle in England. Now, changing the legitimacy principle comes with peril, in that you're relying on something new. But that said, when you can't rely on the old one, that's often the best case. All right, so this hits another head when Henry VIII brings the Reformation to England. Now, we can argue why he did this. We believe that his dynastic concerns, which are kind of the famous story, which some people now would say, well, that's kind of a wives' tale. He really did it because, for a variety of reasons, including purely economic ones, and he does confiscate the wealth of the monasteries of England, which is a huge boon to his wealth. But one thing our framework also suggests is that not having an adult male heir for a king that already has legitimacy concerns is not a trivial thing. So the conventional reasons, at least they also played some type of role. And this helped, and regardless of how endogenous you might think the Reformation are, what it did practically was it knocked one of the other two legs of legitimacy out from the Tudors. So Henry VII knocked the first leg out, the House of Lords. Henry VIII does the second by knocking out the church. What this means, for our sake and for the sake of our story, is that this should have encouraged them to use the House of Commons all the more, because this is now the one group that can really help legitimate rule. So one thing we do is we just try to say, well, if this is how we're thinking about it, do we actually see this in the history? So that this here shows you the number of acts. So when we're talking about using the House of Commons, what we mean by that is ruling through acts of parliament, right? And what this means in this case here is that we should see more acts just within the reign of Henry VIII after the Reformation vis-a-vis before the Reformation. Certainly see that's the case. So not only is Parliament putting forth a lot more acts, now some of these have to do with the Reformation, many don't, but they're also in session much longer too. So you see, previously, prior to the Reformation, there's, two big gaps where Henry's not even calling Parliament. Prior to 1689, Parliament would really only be in session if the king or queen called them. They weren't always in session like they are today. Another thing we can look at here are acts versus proclamations. So you might think of proclamations as kind of like executive orders, if you're more familiar with the U.S. case. It's more that it's more unilateral. That's, I think, the key kind of distinction here. And what we do here is now we look at how the various tutors use acts versus proclamations to rule, and we think of the use of acts to rule vis-a-vis proclamations as using commons and using the law as put forth by Parliament to rule. And you can see it's really the final column that's important here. This number dips pretty dramatically, particularly with Henry VIII. So in fact, he rules more with acts than with proclamations. That is, the ratio is below 1, whereas previous kings, that was not the case. Again, in part because especially the House of Commons was just not a very important part of the legal and ruling coalition prior to the Tudors. We can also say, well, adding representation is also an important way of, is also rather a way of increasing the power of Parliament, increasing its diversity of voice. And in what this really means is it makes it harder for the Crown to just co-opt Parliament. The more people they are, the more representatives there are, and the more representative they actually are. So what you see here is that the Tudors by far added the most MPs to Parliament, and these weren't just people that would be under their thumb. So what we did is we broke it down by boroughs that were eventually classified as rotten boroughs by the 1831 Reform Act. Those were boroughs that really weren't in need of representation. They generally were boroughs that had a very, very small amount of people that were they were actually representing, and they were just a way to kind of pack the Parliament. At least you see here, Henry VIII, almost all of the MPs he added were not from rotten boroughs. They were actually places that were in need of representation. You know, kind of some of these new cities that were forming in this period. All right, so what the upshot of all of this, and again, yeah, I wish I had 7 hours to discuss this because it's really hard to get through a lot of this in a relatively short talk, is that by the end of the Tudor period, a new legitimating principle had emerged. That is the upshot of using our framework on this period in English history, and this is legal legitimacy, going through acts of Parliament to rule England, to change the laws of England. This is something that was new in this period. So the term that historians use for this are crown in Parliament rather than crown and Parliament. So prior to this period, it was a period of what was known as crown and Parliament, meaning they both existed. They existed side by side, but the crown was powerful vis-a-vis Parliament. In this case, the crown in Parliament is acting with the consent of Parliament. All right, so by 1603 then, when Elizabeth I dies and James I comes to the throne, the Commons were a powerful legitimating agent. And this is the institutional and cultural setting where the Stuarts enter the stage. So a major distinction between the Stuarts and the Tudors is the Stuarts were more legitimate. And this is, as we're describing, this personal legitimacy, not through the institutional means, but through their personal characteristics. So James I, even though he was not the heir, he was the King of Scotland. He was an experienced ruler, and he was willed the throne by Elizabeth, who died childless. And because of this, there was little succession dispute. There wasn't zero, but the major players got on board even before Elizabeth died. His son, Charles I, who was kind of famous of being at the center of all this, was by the way we describe it, by far the most legitimate of the Stuarts. He was the first male heir to ascend to the throne in over 100 years, since Henry VIII came in 1509. There were no rival claimants. This is something that more or less no one had said in this period except for Edward VI, and he was Protestant. So unlike the last few Tudors, he was not at least on the surface antagonistic. He eventually did become quite antagonistic, especially in his dealings with Scotland. But at least by this metric, this is yet one more that would have bolstered his legitimacy. James II was the least legitimate Stuart king. If for no other reason, he was an avowed Catholic, and in fact, there was a movement called the Exclusion Crisis that happened prior to his coming to the throne that tried to get him to not be the successor to his brother Charles II. But as we'll see here in a second, he was also the wealthiest because the Stuarts were financially independent. This is also kind of a key thing. So remember, we said it's either a legitimate king or a rich king or queen that is going to be most likely to conflict. And it's when we say rich here, what we really mean is not that they had access to a lot of tax revenue, but it said access to a lot of tax revenue that was not dependent on Parliament's authorization. So there's multiple things going on. One is that they attempted, as we'll see in a second here, to bolster these sources of revenue, but they also kind of lucked into it too, namely that the rise in overseas trade bolstered or boosted customs revenues, and customs revenues typically were indirect taxes. They did not require parliamentary authorization to go into the crown's coffers. So what we just do here is we look at total taxation. I think really the two columns here that are of most importance are the fifth and sixth one. So as you'll see here, James II is the wealthiest in terms of tax revenue he had access to. He had, over 3% of GDP went into his coffers. Not that much wealthier in the sense of, just pure tax revenue than some of the early Tudors at least. But the key here is this column 6, that he was not only the wealthiest, but almost all of this revenue, in the case of James II, 87% of it came from indirect sources, again, meaning that they did not require parliamentary authorization. All right, so what happens when a highly legitimate monarch comes to the throne? So what we're essentially kind of describing this clash here of a highly legitimate monarch coming to the throne in which the legitimacy principle that they inherit is one in which a highly legitimate agent is the one that really has a lot of bargaining power. All right. So in our framework, then, this is precisely when we predict conflict will happen. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be conflict on the battlefield. And we predict in particular that it will probably happen with the ones who's most legitimate and the richest. That is precisely who it ended up happening with in terms of these were the two that were dethroned. And again, this is kind of repeated before, so I won't take up too much time because I know we're running low on time. But the physical battlefield does end up happening, but it's a last resort. There can be conflicts over the legitimacy principle, which both James I and Charles I really had major conflicts with Parliament over, as we'll see in one second. Within the halls of Parliament, if you agree on the legitimacy principle of legal legitimation, or eventually, again, on the physical battlefield. And all of this leads us to this final point, is that the Civil Wars and Glorious Revolution, which are viewed as these two major events by this literature, were manifestations of what we're going to view as a legitimacy conflict between the highly legitimate Stuarts and the recently propped up and legitimate Parliament. So in a sense, what we're going to do here is reinterpret these. It's not a radical 180-degree reinterpretation of, say, the North Weingast view, but it definitely sheds some new light, and I think it helps resolve some puzzles that are not resolved by there. So again, our framework is when a relatively rich and legitimate ruler like Charles I comes to the throne, he wants a weak legitimating agent. So what he should try to do then is, if he can, is appeal to other legitimating principles. Yes, they might not be as strong, and they might not be able to legitimate him as well as the ones he inherited, but that doesn't matter to him. He has legitimacy. So both James I and Charles I tried to push this. And they tried to push this by really appealing to what is known as the divine right of kings. This is something that previous English kings did not really appeal to. It's this idea that it's their divine right. It's that it's God that anoints them. It's not parliamentary consent that matters to rule. Now, if that were to become the legitimating principle of English rule, there's no role for Parliament, or there's little role for Parliament in ruling England in this case. And so one thing, so we view Charles the First's decision not to share rule, his period of personal rule between 1629 and 1640, when he does not call Parliament, as a manifestation of this desire to change the legitimacy principle of England, and in doing so, shutting out Parliament. So in the North and Weingast world, you have transgressions of rights that, it's Charles I transgressing the property rights. It's even in some cases kind of the constitutional rights, but it's more so the property rights of those of other elites. And he does, in a sense, do this. He is in search of funds. There's, these famous ship money, these famous knight's fee, all of which are kind of these old rights that he starts claiming to gain money. And in part because he needs money because Parliament's not there. He's not calling Parliament. But what we view these transgression of rights not as the cause of the Civil Wars, as is the case in both North and Weingast, Essamilgo Robinson, Brenner, who's a historian of this period, is a similar view. But it's a consequence of the broader legitimacy conflict that arises between Charles I and Parliament. Okay? The Glorious Revolution, we argue, can be interpreted in the same way. This was a king that was much less legitimate. In fact, Parliament had already, as I mentioned, tried to remove him even before he came to the throne in 1685. But he ascended to the throne at age 51 with no heir. He was Catholic, but Parliament felt that they could wait him out until he had a son that was born on June 10th, 1688, and almost immediately baptized. And within 3 weeks, William's on the shores, making sure that this new Catholic line, which could have which certainly could have used a new legitimating principle, would have ruled England. So again, we argue that the Glorious Revolution was more of a legitimacy conflict between James II and Parliament about the rights of the crown. Catholicism was a mean to this end because Catholicism in the Catholic Church represented a major alternative to legitimating rule and a major alternative legitimating agent, at least the church in Rome. All right, so there's a number of puzzles that, again, some of which I've gone into more deeply than others, that the legitimacy conflict view resolves. And again, I think that that's the way to view our paper. We're not trying to overturn the conventional wisdom, we're trying to add nuance to it, and in doing so, we're resolving some puzzles. So I think very clearly the centrality of religion to the conflict becomes apparent in our interpretation. It's not even mentioned. And the conventional, at least kind of political economy / economics view of this period, despite the fact that if you look at the historiography of both the civil wars, which is more or less, viewed as a Puritan revolt, and the Glorious Revolution, religion plays a very central role. And the second puzzle, which is the one I kind of mentioned at the beginning, that how does Parliament actually constrain rule if they don't have access to coercive power, which they didn't after the First Civil War? Why does William and Mary submit to the Constitution when they did have access to this mercenary army that in Parliament did not? Just pure rule by power does not really resolve this, but the legitimacy view does. And I think, so we have time for questions. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I guess in particular, as you were going through sort of these various principles of legitimacy, I found it to be really interesting, especially coming at this from the perspective of the urban planning program at USC, and also doing research with the space industry. So one of the questions that I was curious about is sort of how legitimacy could be applied, or these principles could be applied to international law and organizations. So, for example, the UN, the Law of Seas, the Outer Space Treaty, and just sort of generally, how do we determine and regulate legitimate action in the global commons without any real enforcement mechanisms?
Yeah. Oh, this is a great question. I mean, these are things that we've been, talking about. Yeah, as I mentioned, for the better part of the last decade, is thinking about not just historical examples, but and not just even as you mentioned here, you might say domestic examples, but international legitimacy as well. We view as incredibly important. And I think you brought at the very end, you mentioned something with the absence of enforcement mechanisms. So one thing our framework would suggest, and I believe just to be true, in part because, of course, I create the framework, but is that legitimacy can go a long way as long as the norms associated with, what we call the legitimacy principle, whatever that means. In the case of various international treaties, who are the relevant players, are followed. Without enforcement mechanisms, though, once the norms break down, everything can unravel rather quickly, because what that means is that the legitimacy principle that everything that had been built is based on no longer applies, because legitimacy principles are largely based on norms. I didn't use that word in the talk, but it kind of, hopefully it was implied, because we definitely use it in the paper. And these norms are historically driven. They don't come from thin air. They come from the past and what worked at one point in time. So it's a great question, and I think and it's why it's why some level of enforcement mechanisms are necessary. Now, that said, when the enforcement mechanisms are weak but do exist, that's where legitimacy probably has the most bite. And that's kind of what we tried to say here too, is these things can substitute for each other, but you generally need some of both.
Got it. Thank you. That's really
Great
interesting.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Mark Kayama?
Yeah, so thanks.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah. So my question is, you've made, so what's nice here, I think, is making legitimacy endogenous in some sense. And so that's kind of the big, contribution to this framework. But then when you decide whether a ruler is legitimate or not, you're making kind of a hard and fast exogenous distinction, like high and low, which is obviously partly true to some extent. But if you think about Queen Elizabeth, she begins kind of illegitimate, as you say. She's a woman and she was a bastard, and her rule's contended. But at some point in her reign, she becomes legitimate through her rule. So by ruling in a good way, by defending the country from the Spanish Armada, etc., she becomes more legitimate. And so there should be within rule a variation that you might be able to exploit in terms of these edicts or acts or something else. Whereas Charles I begins very legitimate because he's the first surviving son of James, but his initial couple of years of ruling are a total disaster. He has like a failed war against the French and disastrous kind of stuff. And so he kind of, by acting the way he does, he seems to undermine the legitimacy of a monarchy. So it's like a step further. You can think about legitimacy as this kind of a state variable. Rulers might begin with a very high stock of it or low stock. That high stock might erode or it might be built up over time.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I think everything you said is very consistent with the way we're thinking about it. And I think it is actually a very nice way of putting it, in that, you know, when I was showing you all the various metrics we have, we can kind of think about it exactly as you say, is just kind of the personal legitimacy or the personal characteristics that lend to legitimacy. What we also, you know, are very kind of cognizant of and is actually central to our thesis is that there are other things you can do to affect the legitimacy of your rule. And in fact, what we would precisely expect those that have characteristics that make them less legitimate to do things to bolster their legitimacy. Those with a high stock would do things that maybe wouldn't do that. So one thing we don't talk about as much is the type of stuff you're talking about, like disastrous rule, for instance, might lower the legitimacy. Now it depends on, and this might, I don't know if this is a discussion for here or not. It matters how we think about legitimacy, because one thing we do mention in the paper that I didn't mention here is the distinction between legitimacy and popularity. In that you can do things that make you popular, but that doesn't necessarily make you any more legitimate. In that, in the way that we're defining it, namely, this person has the right to rule. Likewise, you can do things that make you highly unpopular, but did not change your legitimacy. Now, when we're thinking about how well one rules is affecting their legitimacy, I also think that matters based on, you know, the legitimating principle of society. So, you know, China, you know, in case I know you know, well, you know, you have like something like the mandate of heaven, which is precisely that, right? Like the ruler is legitimate, or the ruler can be shown to be illegitimate by being a bad ruler, essentially. Whereas in England, that wouldn't have been as much the case. That it's not that you have the right to kill the ruler just because they ruled poorly. It was not something that historically was but I really like that way of thinking about it. And I think that is very much consistent. Yeah, by no means do we want the reader to think, or you guys to think, that each of these Tudor and Stuart monarchs had this stock of legitimacy based on these things that they had coming to the crown, and that doesn't change. And in fact, very much their actions are meant to affect that one way or the other. Great point, though. Thanks.
So a quick follow-up from Desiree on this question. I'll read it and she can follow up if she wants. In the model, why can't the monarch also choose to create legitimating agents instead of bargaining with current agents?
Okay, so yeah, it's a good point in the sense that the way we're thinking about it is that we're defining this legitimating principle as not just what one has in the past had, or the ways in the past rulers have gained legitimacy, but it helps define the set of possible legitimating agents. Now, to Desiree's point, you know, within that set, you can choose somebody new. And this is what Henry VII essentially does. You know, Henry VII, you know, moves away from the lords and places more on the gentry. Now, these were in a sense weaker legitimating agents because they didn't have a real say historically in English history, but because they had some degree of power, they were at least in that set that he chooses. Now, to kind of, you know, I do think, though, that one thing we would say is that there is a limit on who you can choose, and that is determined by the legitimating principle. Like, you couldn't just turn to you or I to legitimate the King of France. or something like that, or frankly, even the United States president.
Jared, just
yeah.
to follow up, just in general, though, I was expecting that there's some kind of choice in the ruler and the tools in which he can promote his legitimacy. Here, there's no choice. It's basically you bargain with the current agents. But to Mark's point, I mean, you could do other things that could probably help you gain legitimacy. So not just creating legitimate agents, but other enact policy or do some reforms to kind of increase your legitimacy without having to rely on the current agents.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of, in a sense, the way we're viewing it is yes and no, in that you can absolutely change agents. That's one thing that is not only fits within our framework, but is actually a pretty important part of our story. One thing that we're not as strong, and I think we differ with some scholars here in terms of thinking about how actions themselves affect legitimacy. In terms of when we're talking, if you remember, it was a number of slides ago. I guess I go back to it, but I just talk about it. Action-based legitimacy is not the way we're thinking about it. At least it's not so much the effectiveness of your actions, but do you have the legitimate right to make that action? That's where I mentioned, the U.S. president can declare war, at least in a time of emergency, but not enact tax legislation. So, and this is also this, I think, distinction between being popular and being legitimate. So what in the paper, what we describe as, you can be legitimate but not popular. So there's been plenty of presidents, U.S. presidents, that have had popularity rankings well below 40%. But no one disputed that they were the legitimate president. Meanwhile, you might have, say, a military coup in a country that is very popular. Maybe the old ruler was a tyrant, but by any possible kind of metric from that country, or any possible way of thinking about it from that country's past, the military coup is illegitimate. So we're not, I'd say that just purely acting in a good way can decrease your popularity and maybe increase the probability of uprising, but the uprising would not be one over the legitimacy. It would be about something else. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something we do need to be very clear about and flesh out, though. It's a good point.
Yeah, Jared, thanks for the presentation. I found your framework very convincing and really reasonable. But one basic question I had was, did you ever mention the wealthiness as a factor of framework? Because when you are explaining the tutors, you only mentioned, you only focused on personal legitimacy, but when it came to stewards, I think you mentioned both high personal legitimacy and their rich background. So I was wondering where this worthiness fits in your framework.
Yeah. So I mean, so we view, because we view access to coercive power as a substitute for legitimacy, and we view, so really the way we're thinking about it, our resources are a means to buy coercive power. You can't really buy legitimacy, but you can buy coercive power. So we're thinking of these two as substitutes. So we should be thinking of, on the one hand, a very rich king that also has high legitimacy is the one that's most going to conflict. But a rich king with low legitimacy might still need legitimacy, in the sense that, there are things that money cannot buy. But it's really, we can think about it as, kind of two spectrums, where it's the low legitimacy, low resources king that's in the war. So yeah, I mean, these are things that substitute and can help us understand certain aspects of the situation. In fact, so maybe a better way to answer your question would be to note that even though Henry VIII had a lot of his taxation was what we call direct taxation, it came from the king, he was also very wealthy because he confiscated the wealth of the monasteries. So he actually had a decent amount of financial independence, which, using the framework, the previous frameworks, would make it really hard to understand why he still went to Parliament as often as he did, which the evidence makes very clear that he did. If he was wealthy enough to not use them, because you'd prefer not to deal with an agent that wants different things than you if you can avoid it. So this is where we think of these two things as as substituting in the sense that he didn't have, even though he had one aspect, he didn't have the other. So I don't know how complete that answer was. But yeah, we were thinking of both as important, and really resources as being important, mainly for what they can buy in terms of access to coercive power.
Just what if Elizabeth had changed back the religion to Catholicism? Wouldn't that have changed the course of religion? How do we view future monarchs to be legitimate?
Possibly. I mean, that's what her sister attempted to do, Mary, and gained the nickname Bloody Mary for a reason. Yeah, I mean, I think that had Elizabeth attempted to do this, and I mean, maybe go further. Say that the papacy was successful in having Elizabeth assassinated, or Mary, Queen of Scots, come to the throne. Essentially, there were movements to try to put a Catholic monarch on the throne. Had those been successful, or had Elizabeth, in this alternative world where she was a Catholic, yeah, I mean, I think that you might have seen a very different world. This is I think, I think counterfactual history can sometimes be very enlightening when you only make one or two steps. When you go too far down that road, it becomes something that's inexplicable. But I think one thing that I think you're kind of getting at here with this question, Desiree, that is really nice, is that so much of what we're describing here is very contingent on random chance too. I mean, namely, had Elizabeth or Mary been men, that the world might be very different too. And certainly, yeah. So Mary's a Catholic in part because her mother's Catholic, and Elizabeth is Protestant because her mother's Protestant. So yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, because then you're going down a number of steps. But I think one thing our framework does suggest is that sometimes that these individual things end up being really important. We like to think of broader institutional features as being the drivers of history. In many cases, they are. But in this case, there were historical instances that really interacted with those institutions that changed them dramatically.
All right. Well, thank you, Jared. It was a great workshop. In 2 weeks, we'll have Jared's office mate, Mark Weidenmeyer, who's also at the business school at Chapman. He'll be giving a workshop on the Great Depression. So thanks to everybody who attended today, and for the great questions that Jared got, and for Jared to take 90 minutes out of his day to share his research with us. Thanks very much.